I'm very happy to be here. You've already heard people talk about how to choose a mission for your startup and how to pick a co-founder. I'm going to talk about a different topic, which is how to solve problems in the world, but also how to solve problems within your company. There we go. All right. So my organization is Clearer Thinking. We help people make better decisions. And what I'm going to tell you about today is what we call our 4 I's framework. So now, as you know, entrepreneurs solve problems, but not just any kind of problem. They often have to solve persistent problems, which are problems that have been around for a long time and that many people may have already tried to solve, yet they still are persistent. So for example, entrepreneurs take on things, big problems in the world like people that don't exercise enough or public education isn't as good as we want it to be. They also take on persistent problems within their organizations, like the fact that sales may not be growing as fast as you want, or there might be problems with your company culture. But the thing about persistent problems is that because you know that other people have tried to solve them and they're still there, that raises a big, important question, which is why will you succeed if all previous attempts have failed? And there's a key takeaway here, which is that to succeed, you should understand why the previous attempts have failed. And that's what this 4 I's framework is about. It's about understanding the problem deeply enough that you can avoid the mistakes of others and maybe actually succeed at solving it. Okay, so let's think for a moment about when can you expect a problem to already have been solved? Well, first of all, people should have incentives to solve it. But that's not enough. If people have incentives, they may still not have the knowledge of how to solve that problem. But suppose they have the incentive and they have the knowledge. Well, they still might not have the resources to solve it. They may not have the money, the people they need. If people have the incentive to solve a problem and the knowledge to solve it and the resources, then rationally, if they were behaving rationally, you'd expect them to have already solved it. But people are not always rational. And this is where we get the 4 I's framework. So this gives us 4 perspectives for thinking about why a problem has not already been solved so that we can come up with a correct strategy of how to solve it. So perspective 1 is the perspective of incentives. Perspective 2, we think about ignorance. Perspective 3, we think about investment. And perspective 4, we think about irrationality. And very conveniently, these all start with the letter I. So let's start with number 1, incentives. So when you take this perspective, you ask the question, do people have sufficient incentive to solve this problem? And FedEx is a really nice example. See, FedEx packages in certain areas, they go through a big center, and they have to put the packages onto planes very rapidly. And FedEx couldn't get this to happen fast enough, and it was causing major bottlenecks. And they tried everything they could think of to solve this problem. It just wouldn't go fast enough. And then one day, someone pointed out that the workers who were loading onto these planes, they were being paid hourly. In other words, they got paid more if they spent longer putting the packages on. So FedEx tried switching it to pay them a fixed cost for the whole night and let them go home as soon as they were finished, and magically the problem solved itself. In other words, management didn't have to figure out how to solve the problem. They just needed to give the incentive to solve it, and the workers figured out how to solve it. Or take another really nice example from Xerox. So Xerox had two different copy machines, and interestingly enough, they were finding their newer, better model was selling much worse than their old, worse model. And they couldn't make any sense of this. And they sent someone out to investigate, and they discovered that the sales commission for the older model was actually more than it is for the new model. And as soon as they changed that, of course, the new model started selling much better, but the salespeople had been incentivized to sell the old, worse version of their product. So what do you do if there's a problem with incentives when you're tackling some major problem in the world? Well, you can offer grants and competitions, and that will incentivize new behavior. You can also lobby or try to influence regulation and taxes, which will de-incentivize other behaviors. Well, what about problems of incentives within an organization? Well, you can give bonuses and recognition to try to incentivize certain employee behaviors. You can set up rules and monitoring, which will de-incentivize behaviors. And this leads us to I number 2 of the 4 I's framework, which is ignorance. So when you adopt this perspective, you ask, is the information known that is needed to solve this problem? So look at this disturbing survey that was done in 2 rural districts in northern Tanzania. They asked people what they believed about condoms, and they found that 47% of people believe that there is HIV in condoms, and 49% believe that condoms contain small worms. Now, you can imagine trying to spend a huge amount of money to distribute condoms in this area with absolutely no success, because the problem is ignorance about condoms. And until you correct the problem of ignorance, you're going to have no luck getting people to use them. Or take this interesting example. So you can see income in the US has skyrocketed over the decades, but happiness has essentially been flat. This is a problem of ignorance because we know how to make society wealthier. We're very good at that. But we don't understand very well how to make society happier. And we need basic research to really understand what policies will improve the happiness line, not just the income line. So what do you do if there's a major world problem where ignorance is at play? Well, you can use education and advertising to spread ideas. Or maybe if the ignorance is a global ignorance, in other words, as a society, we don't know the answer to something, you can fund basic research and you can fund science. What about ignorance inside an organization? Well, you can use training. Or if it's ignorance, again, that's company-wide, you can do basic data collection, interview your customers, collect survey data, and then you can dispel the ignorance that way. This takes us to I number 3, investment. So for I number 3, you ask the question, have the necessary resources been invested in solving this problem? So this is an interesting chart. This shows the number of academic publications from a very large citation database on different topics. As you can see, there are about 840 academic publications in this database on the dung beetle, about 205 on Star Trek, and about 25 on human extinction. So you may notice that resources may not be that appropriately allocated in this situation. Obviously, Star Trek should be the number 1. Here's another example. Suppose you really care about helping animals, and you're thinking, well, maybe I should make an app to help people find the right pet dog or cat to adopt that's in a shelter. Or maybe I should start a vegan mayonnaise company that I compete with non-vegan mayonnaise companies to basically replace animal products. Which of these should you do? Well, if you really care about helping animals, you might be interested to note that for every pet animal euthanized, about 2,500 farm animals are slaughtered. It's a pretty big differential. And you may be surprised to learn, though, that almost all of the money, the vast majority of the money that goes towards helping animals goes to pet animals. So you can see, if you're someone who cares about not just dogs and cats, but also other animals, that this is a very strange allocation of resources, and there may be huge opportunities in putting more resources into helping other types of animals. So what do you do if there's an issue of investment in a big world problem? Well, you can add more funding, or you can help publicize that issue to get other people to bring in funding, bring in talent, bring in other resources. In your organization, of course, if there's an issue of investment, you can try expanding a budget in that area or expanding your team. And this brings us to the last I, irrationality. So here you ask the question, are human biases or decision-making failures causing this problem? Now, the way that our minds work is that we don't take into account all information in a situation. We don't calculate every single possibility. Our minds use shortcuts, simple heuristics to make decisions. It's actually known that there are more than 20 different biases that affect our decision-making, sometimes to a great detriment. Now, does anyone know what this is? Yes, it is an X-ray, and what is circled here is a surgical sponge that was left inside someone's intestine. Now, perfectly rational doctors don't leave surgical sponges in people's intestines, but human doctors do, because human doctors, like all humans, are biased. They have decision-making errors that they make. And so the World Health Organization developed a checklist that they give surgeons. It doesn't teach the surgeons things that they don't know, so much as just get them to do the things that they already know they should do in a systematic fashion. And this is the outcome of applying these checklists in different hospitals. And they found that about, on average, 41% reduction in surgery complications result just from getting doctors to use a simple checklist. Here's another interesting example, organ donation. So in some countries, in order to become an organ donor, you have to check a box on some form saying, I want to be an organ donor. And that's called explicit consent. In other countries, they use presumed consent, which means you might have to mail in a form to the government or go into some government office to say, I don't want to be an organ donor. If you don't do that, you're automatically an organ donor. Now, if we were perfectly rational, you might think on a big decision like whether you donate your organs, where other people's lives are at stake, it wouldn't matter how you set up the default because people are going to think it through and they're going to make the decision that makes sense. But the reality is the complete opposite. Depending on whether they use this kind of explicit consent or presumed consent, you get radically different amounts of total consent in different countries. And in fact, you find about 26% more livers transplanted per capita in presumed consent countries. So what do you do if there's a big problem in the world where irrationality seems to be the issue? Well, you can reward rationality. For example, let's say people aren't saving enough money, you can give them tax incentives to save more money. Or you can use smart defaults. Like we saw in the organ donation example, the way you set up a default can massively impact people's behavior. What about in an organization? Well, if you're seeing irrationality there, you can apply checklists to get people to systematically apply every good behavior that they're supposed to and avoid biases. Or you can require second opinions on important decisions, because for some types of decision-making biases, it's easier for other people to see our bias than it is for us to see it. So by having another person check, you can actually avoid some of them. So in conclusion, I'd like you to think about using the 4 I's framework to solve persistent problems, whether in the world or within your organization. And to do this, remember the 4 I's: incentives, ignorance, investment, and irrationality. And I'd really love to hear from you with any questions you have or comments. Thank you for having me.